Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jauan Jennings, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 15 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, then transitioning into talking about my top 40 ranked wide receivers for Week 15. If you guys are looking for my thoughts on an individual player, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there, like in every single video. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, of course, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Besides the daily content, of course, we're live streaming every single day on the channel. If you want to be notified when I'm live, again, the bell notification is for that. Again, later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. PST, I will be live here on the channel. If you have any questions regarding Week 15 and beyond for the fantasy football playoffs, I'm more than happy to help. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups going into Week 15 based on statistics allowed at the wide receiver position by each individual defense between Week 6 through 14. What we have found as of late is that the Falcons, Texans, Vikings, Saints, Cowboys, Browns, etc. are the most advantageous matchup at the position, as these teams are all allowing over 30 fantasy points per game on average based on receiving statistics isolated, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns only to opposing wide receivers. Therefore, if we have our wide receivers taking these teams on, for example, Jakobi Meyers taking on the Falcons, or for example, Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle both coming off of incredible performances this most recent week against the New York Jets, now have an opportunity of taking on the Texans defense that cannot stop a soul within the receiving game. Therefore, we'll take advantage of these overall matchups. I will go into even further detail when I talk about these wide receivers on an individual basis, but just wanted to go ahead and give you guys an understanding as to what are the more advantageous matchups based on the recent performances that these defenses have had against opposing wide receivers. Now, some of the more disadvantageous matchups revolve around taking on the Eagles, the Packers, the Commanders, the Panthers, etc. Now, this being said, the Eagles, they've given up their fair share of points to Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, even guys like Adam Thielen last week. It's not impossible to score against these teams, but it certainly is difficult. So JSN, DK Metcalf will certainly have their hands full taking on the Packers. Jair Alexander is expected to return, which should make DK Metcalf's overall approach a little bit more of a difficult or more straining event. But as we continue, I'll go into even further detail regarding these matchups. Just wanted to go ahead and preface before we get into today's content. Again, before we get into my top 40 wide receiver rankings, a reminder for those of you guys who want my rankings every single Sunday, besides the live stream that we'll be conducting from 7 to 10 a.m. like we do every single Sunday morning with updated rankings. If you're looking for half or full PPR rankings, including flex, you can either check out the Patreon or travel on over via the link down in the description to Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to claim the first time deposit offer, but you'll get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday for the remainder of the season in order to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. For those of you who are interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are eligible based on your current location, fantastic. If not, of course, you could potentially check out the Patreon to get those rankings. Link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's begin with my number one at the top 40 wide receiver rankings. It is, of course, Ja'Marr Chase, coming off of another nuclear performance of 38.1 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. This soon to be triple crown winner, in terms of triple crown being the most receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns within a single season of the wide receiver position. The last time we saw that was Cooper Kupp in 2021. Ja'Marr Chase is in line to capture that this year. Now, going into this week, he takes on the Tennessee Titans, the 17th best matchup at the position. They've most recently given up 8 catches for 86 to BTJ. To McLaurin, 8 catches for 73 and 2 touchdowns. Nico Collins, 5 for 92 and a touchdown. We have seen wide receiver ones dominate against this defense as of late. The Tennessee Titans will have their hands full, certainly with Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins this weekend. But of course, you know that Ja'Marr Chase is an automatic number one, primarily because thus far this season, there have been 12 different wide receiver performances that have accompanied 30-plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Ja'Marr Chase has accounted for 3 of those 12 performances. No other wide receiver has more than one game of that singular kind of upside. Again, he's the highest upside wide receiver, auto start. Moving on to our number 2, another auto star, we have Puka Nacua. Now, first and foremost, I love the integration of the Rams trying to get Puka Nacua the ball as much as they possibly can. The more touches he has, the more of an impact he will make within the game. And considering how incredible of a player he is, of course, there's even more upside. Now, he's coming off of a game in which he had 12 receptions, but 5 rushing attempts. I love the integration within the jet sweep game. Now, again, that is only going to happen when you play against the defense that primarily sits in zone and primarily plays with 5 DBs. When you're playing against a defense that has a nickel coverage almost the entirety of the game, it's going to open up more opportunities for Puka Nacua to succeed in that facet. Going into this week's matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, expect less of that rushing upside. Nonetheless, this upcoming matchup on Thursday night is expected to be the highest scoring game based on Vegas's overall totals. The implication assumes that this is going to be a high scoring game between the Rams and 49ers. Again, both these teams in a must-win scenario in order to give themselves a chance to win the NFC West. Our number 3, we have Nico Collins, who again, over the course of the last 2 games prior to the bye week, was getting himself an average of 10 targets per game and scored 17.7 and 15.9 fantasy points in a half PPR. Had a couple touchdowns called back, but hey, listen, who's counting? I am. Anyway, continuing on, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Miami Dolphins, this is expected to be a shootout, especially when we take into account the fact that the Houston Texans defense is one of the worst secondaries in the league in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers. This is only going to have to force CJ Stroud and Nico Collins to come out every single drive and throw the ball on a consistent rate. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, we have seen wide receivers against the Miami Dolphins defense find success. Most recently, of course, Garrett Wilson, 7 catches for 114. Davante Adams, 9 for 109 and a touchdown. Puka Nacua, 9 for 98. So hopefully Nico Collins is going to continue that trend of number 1 wide receivers succeeding against his defense. Our number 4, speaking of the Miami Dolphins, we have Tyreek Hill. Like I mentioned just moments ago, the Houston Texans defense cannot stop a soul. They are the second best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing nearly 33 fantasy points per game. So Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle should be in great hands going into this week. And luckily for those of us who have Tyreek Hill, who have struggled over the entire season, considering his lack of production, as of late, he has caught fire. He has scored at least 1 touchdown in 4 of the last 5 games. He's coming off of his best game of the season in terms of a season high 14 targets, 10 receptions. As long as he's getting hot, better late than never. Going into this week, especially considering how well Tua has played, since Tua has returned, he's had a 76% passing completion percentage. We're expecting even more upside this week from Tyreek Hill. To close out the S tier, we have, of course, Justin Jefferson. We have to have him in the S tier. He's an auto start every time out, coming off of an incredible performance of 7 catches, 132 and 2 touchdowns for 28.7 fantasy points in a half PPR. But now has to take on the Chicago Bears. Last time out against this defense in week 12. Only 5 targets, 2 catches, 27, while Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson were the primary benefactors of the offensive approach. Now, going into this week, could very easily see that approach once again taken by the offensive coordinator / play caller of the Minnesota Vikings, in which they're ignoring the overall usage of Justin Jefferson and creating a more of a decoy performance from him. Hopefully that's not going to be the case. Recently, we have seen wide receiver ones against this team. McLaurin, 5 for 125. Of course, Addison, most recently against this team, went for over 100 and scored himself a touchdown. Watson, 4 for 150. Jennings, most recently, 7 for 90 and 2 touchdowns. Hopefully Justin Jefferson finds himself upside within the upcoming performance. Number 6, to begin the A tier, we have Amon-Ra St. Now, I understand he's coming off of a lackluster performance of only 5 receptions and 43 receiving yards. But going into this week against the Buffalo Bills, indoors in Detroit with no weather impact, this is expected to be a shootout between these two teams. Both high-powered offenses and both secondaries that as of late have struggled against opposing wide receivers. Most recently, the Rams wide receivers from the slot position combined for 16 targets, 13 receptions, 190 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown against the Buffalo Bills this most recent week. Again, if we're going to be in a situation in which Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to get himself even more utilization within the receiving game from the slot position thus far this season, 51% of his receptions from the slot. If that kind of exposure to opportunity is only going to continue to grow based on the upcoming matchup, this defense allowing over 27 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. It hasn't just been Puka and Kupp as of late. Worthy scored a touchdown. The Indianapolis Colts wide receivers had themselves a great week with Joe Flacco at quarterback. The expectation is success this week. Moving on to our number 7, we have A.J. Brown. Now, A.J. Brown has been underwhelming as of late. Specifically, this is the first time in the last 2 seasons, 2023 and 2024, in which we have seen A.J. Brown have back-to-back games of less than 10 fantasy points in a half PPR. This is the first time we have seen it, and usually the Eagles' way is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And in this case, the squeaky wheel being A.J. Brown is going to get himself a lot of opportunity because that is how Nick Sirianni and this offense has functioned over the course of his last 3 years. So as long as A.J. Brown is complaining, which he certainly has on the sideline as of late, this is going to force Sirianni, Kellen Moore, and Jalen Hurts to get more integration from A.J. Brown within the offense. We have most recently seen performances from wide receivers against the Steelers. McLaurin went for 113, Higgins 69 and a touchdown, Chase 86 and a touchdown, Jeudy this most recent week 64 in a touchdown. The expectation is upside this week. Now, of course, I understand Jalen Hurts throwing for 108 and 118 passing yards in the last 2 weeks, certainly underwhelming. Hopefully that's going to be addressed going forward. Number 8, we have Jauan Jennings. Like I mentioned over the course of the last couple of days via live stream, I am very excited about the potential of Jauan Jennings going into this week, mainly because his most recent performance against the LA Rams, who he will be taking on this upcoming Thursday night. Back in week 3 against the Rams with no Deebo Samuel in the lineup, 12 targets, 11 catches, 175, 3 touchdowns, 41 fantasy points. An incredible game. Over the course of the last 5 games in which Jauan Jennings has played within this offense, playing 80+% of the offensive snaps with no crazy weather conditions, a la the Buffalo Bills game, he is averaging 20.98 fantasy points points per game. But in those performances, we're talking about 24.5, 6.5, 20.1, 12.8, and then, of course, the 41-point performance. Taking on the Rams, the 10th best matchup at the position, should be immediate success in this upcoming shootout. Number 9, we have T. Higgins, who's, yes, coming off of an underwhelming performance in which, Chase Brown, the running back, had himself more targets, receptions, and receiving workload. That is definitely going to happen at times, but I don't expect that to be a weekly trend for this offense, and specifically T. Higgins, who has been incredible. This is just one day, not day one, of an experience in which we're going to continue to see underwhelming performances. Taking on the Tennessee Titans, he will get back on track. Again, it is a middle-of-the-pack matchup, but most recently we have seen wide receivers on the outside, like Collins, 92 and a touchdown, McLaurin, 73 and 2 touchdowns, and BTJ with 8 catches, 86 this most recent week. I'm expecting, again, double, triple coverage in the direction of Ja'Marr Chase, hopefully, which will open up more opportunities for T. Higgins. Number 10, to close out the A tier, we have Cooper Kupp. Look, Cooper Kupp has scored 4 receiving touchdowns in the last 4 games. As long as he's implied for a potential upcoming matchup where it's going to be a shootout between the Rams and the 49ers, you would assume that Kupp is going to be highly integrated within this pass attack, once again, as he typically is. Now, again, Cooper Kupp has himself a pretty good track record against the San Francisco 49ers, taking him on in his entire career. But in the last 5 games in which he has taken on the Niners, he has either put up 100 receiving yards or a touchdown. Sometimes throughout that last 5 games, doing both. We're expecting a lot of upside within the upcoming matchup and hopefully finding the end zone for another consecutive week here. To begin the B tier, we have Courtland Sutton. Look, I don't think Courtland Sutton is a B-tier receiver, but we quite frankly just cannot fit this player on the graphic, so we have to put him here. But let's just be frank about the situation. Courtland Sutton has been unstoppable, averaging 16.52 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. He is the number 5 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game since week 8. He's been unstoppable, averaging 9.5 targets per game. That is ample opportunity. And going into this weekend's matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, expect more of the same. If he scores a touchdown, easily could be in the top 5 conversation. If not, expect him to get his 7 to 8 catches, 70 to potentially 100 plus receiving yards within the upcoming performance. Now, another wide receiver that needs respect, the thumbnail of today's episode, is Terry McLaurin. Even though he is coming off of a bye, understand that thus far this season, since week 3, he has only had 1 performance of less than 11 fantasy points. Again, he has been unstoppable in the last 11 games, scoring 9 receiving touchdowns, averaging 14.95 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time, and now has an opportunity of taking on the New Orleans Saints, who is the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 31 fantasy points per game. Terry McLaurin in this game, which should be a one-sided affair, should be scoring in bunches. Moving on to our number 13, we have Mike Evans, who's coming off of an underwhelming performance, but understand that Jalen McMillan, the number 2 receiving option of this offense, isn't going to score 2 touchdowns every week. We're going to expect to see, hopefully this week, Mike Evans finding himself in the end zone, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers, primarily because they are the 9th best matchup. Their secondary has struggled because of the injuries that they have accrued over the course of this entire season, but we have most recently seen wide receiver performances such as D-Hop scoring a touchdown last week, both London and Mooney both surpassing 85 receiving yards against them, and the Cincinnati receivers, 20 catches, 277, and 3 touchdowns as a group. Again, we're expecting high upside here, once again, for Mike Evans. Moving on to our number 14, we have CeeDee Lamb. Look, CeeDee Lamb had a fantastic game, 18.4 fantasy points. The only thing that concerned me was the lack of target opportunity within the second half of that game. Only 7 targets, 6 catches isn't going to cut it because more often than not, he's not going to be scoring those receiving touchdowns. And we're going to have to purely rely upon receptions and receiving yards in order for him to have himself a solid week. Now, going into this week, again, they take on the Carolina Panthers. Wide receivers against them recently: Mike Evans, 8 catches, 118. DeVonta Smith, 4 for 37 and a touchdown. D-Hop, 5 for 35 and a touchdown. We have seen number 1 wide receivers succeed, and hopefully CeeDee Lamb will continue that trend. We just have to be careful with his shoulder. And any given play, he could get injured and he could leave the game. And because of that, it makes him a little bit more of an implied risk within playing him every single time out. Moving on to our number 15, we have Drake London, who has back-to-back games of 10-plus targets. Again, the opportunity share is not the problem. The issue is that this offense does not score touchdowns through the air. Kirk Cousins has yet to throw a touchdown in the last 4 weeks, and of course, that has impacted the overall upside of Drake London, who has a fantastic opportunity to succeed this week against the Raiders. Again, McMillan had himself a great week last week against his defense. Even Mike Evans, 4 catches, 69. D-Hop, 4 catches, 90. Sutton had himself 2 touchdowns and 97 receiving yards recently. So again, a lot of wide receivers have found success against the Las Vegas Raiders. It's just a matter of, is Drake London going to be given the opportunity near the red zone to find himself even more upside this week? Moving on to our number 16, we have Davante Adams. Look, Davante Adams, 4 of the last 5 games, double-digit targets. If he's going to continue to get that opportunity share, we have no complaints. Taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week should be a positive game script, which could lead to less potential passing opportunities in the direction of Davante Adams if Mac Jones and the Jacksonville offense isn't able to continue to keep up. But as of late, we have seen wide receivers such as J-Mo and Amon-Ra St. Brown both eclipse over 120 receiving yards against this defense. Nico Collins over 119. Ridley, most recently, 7 catches, 59, an underwhelming performance, mainly because of Will Levis's shoulder. But nonetheless, we have seen wide receivers dominate. Hopefully, Davante Adams continues the trend. Number 17, we have Jordan Addison. Look, coming off of a nuclear performance of 35.3 fantasy points, 8 catches, 133, 3 touchdowns. Again, a fantastic performance, but now has an opportunity of taking on the Chicago Bears, who, again, their secondary most recently have given up their fair share of points to not only Jordan Addison back in week 12, in which he had 9 targets, 8 catches, 162 and a touchdown, 26.2 fantasy points. But Jennings this most recent week, 7 catches, 90 yards, 2 touchdowns. Christian Watson for 150 on them. McLaurin for 125 on them. My expectation is that Jordan Addison continues to succeed against the Bears secondary. Number 18, we have Jerry Jeudy. Now, there is an implied risk with Jerry Jeudy with the potential return of Thielen, but Jerry Jeudy has cleared away been the primary option within this offense, and I expect him to continue that trend henceforth, even against the Kansas City Chiefs this week, which as of late have been the 12th best matchup at the wide receiver position. Quentin Johnston played well. Joshua Palmer played well against them, even in the absence of Ladd McConkey. Jakobi Meyers, 97 yards. The Carolina Panthers receivers combined for 207 and a touchdown. Buffalo Bills wide receivers, 210 and a touchdown. Jerry Jeudy should be implied for a solid week, having scored 3 receiving touchdowns in the last 4 games. Number 19, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who, as of late, quite frankly, has been the most consistent receiving option within the Seattle Seahawks offense. But even though we would expect that the Seattle Seahawks would get him more implementation in terms of targets and receiving upside, quite frankly, it has not been the case for him nor DK Metcalf. But as of late, Jaxon Smith-Njigba near the red zone, finding himself scoring 4 receiving touchdowns in the last 5 games is what has kept him fantasy relevant and is going to continue to keep him fantasy relevant as they take on the Green Bay Packers this weekend. Again, with Jair Alexander expected to return, most likely covering DK Metcalf in all those overall excursions, we should see a lot more potential opportunities for Jaxon Smith-Njigba within this high-scoring event. Moving on to our number 20, we have Ladd McConkey. The only reason Ladd McConkey sits 1 tier below these prior names that I mentioned is because of his recent injury. But as long as he's healthy, we're firing him up. Taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is an advantageous matchup. The most 3 recent games we have seen Ladd McConkey play, 83, 117 and 123. Those are his receiving yard totals. Again, the lack of a running game in the absence of J.K. Dobbins is only going to continue to lean Justin Herbert in the direction of trusting Ladd McConkey on 3rd downs and continuing to help move the sticks on a consistent basis, considering the run game has not been potent as of late. Moving on to our number 21. Speaking of, the security blanket of an offense, we have Khalil Shakir, who's coming off of another incredible game. This time last week I mentioned Khalil Shakir just doesn't score touchdowns. How do we trust him in a half PPR? In a full PPR, he's fantastic because he's averaging nearly 7 receptions per game. Again, over the course of the last 7 games, when there has been no weather that has been heavily impacting the game, he's getting 8.83 targets, 6.83 receptions per game. But again, this most recent week, getting himself over 100 receiving yards on 5 catches, a receiving touchdown, 19 fantasy points, fantastic. It's the first time he has scored a touchdown since week 3, and hopefully can make that another consecutive week taking on the Detroit Lions this week. This defense is allowing over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Of course, the Bills will have all their weapons available to them. Keon Coleman, Dalton Kincaid expected to return this week, so it should be a little bit more of an exciting matchup and hopefully a shootout between these 2 teams. Moving on to our number 22, we have DJ Moore. Look, DJ Moore last time out against the Minnesota Vikings, who he will be taking on once again this week. Back in week 12, 7 targets, 7 catches, 106 and a touchdown, 23.4 fantasy points. The Vikings are the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing over 31.5 fantasy points per game. We have most recently seen the Atlanta wide receivers, London Mooney and Ray McLeod combined for 19 catches and 310 receiving yards as a trio. Marvin Harrison, 60 and a touchdown. The Chicago wide receivers, when they took on the Minnesota Vikings back in week 12, combined for 21 receptions, 321 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Nick Westbrook-Ikine went for 117 and a touchdown. The expectation is that if DJ Moore is healthy and ready to go, should be an auto start. Moving on to our number 23, we have Garrett Wilson, who has shown signs of life based on the volume of opportunity that he has been granted over the course of the last 2 games, back-to-back weeks of 10-plus targets. Now they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is expected to be a positive game script, and hopefully the New York Jets aren't going to take their foot off the pedal, and they're going to blow out this defense and continue to pour it on. For our fantasy sake, and for the sake of both Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson getting themselves into the double-digit target range. Again, most recently, like I mentioned earlier with Davante Adams, we have seen wide receivers such as Nico Collins and Amon-Ra St. all surpass over 115 receiving yards against this secondary. Hopefully, Garrett Wilson can do much of the same. Very similar to his most recent performance against the Miami Dolphins, in which he had 114 receiving yards. Number 24, we have Adam Thielen. Look, I can't deny it. Adam Thielen getting 10 targets in week 13, 11 targets in week 14. It's undeniable. He is going to be the number one receiving option. This is very reminiscent of what Adam Thielen and Bryce Young did back in 2023 throughout that stretch of time in which Adam Thielen was a top 10 wide receiver option in the National Football League, coming off of this most recent performance of 9 catches, 102. The week prior, 8 catches, 99 and a touchdown. Again, as long as he's going to continue to get himself potentially 10 plus targets, 8 to 9 receptions, and over 100 yards per game, the fact of the matter is he is an auto-start taking on the Cowboys, the 5th best matchup at the wide receiver position this week. Moving on to our number 25, we have Brian Thomas Jr. Now, I understand that having Mac Jones is certainly a downgrade in comparison to having Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, but over the course of the last 3 games with Mac Jones, Brian Thomas Jr. has gotten himself a 29% target share, which is an incredible number. Over the course of those last 3 games, 9.0 targets per game and 13.47 fantasy points per game on average. Taking on the New York Jets this week, we are expecting a negative game script, and in that overall situation, it could lead to even more upside for BTJ, especially considering Sauce Gardner missed this most recent game. If that's going to take place once again, expect for success, especially considering this most recent week. Waddle, 9 for 99. Tyreek Hill, 10 for 115 and a touchdown. Of course, Marvin Harrison and Josh Downs recently scoring touchdowns and getting over 50 receiving yards against the secondary. Moving on to our number 26, we have Jaylen Waddle. Speaking of Waddle, going for 9 catches and 99 yards for 12 targets, again, most recently against the New York Jets, who BTG will be taking on this week. Again, Jaylen Waddle getting himself a lot of opportunity as of late, getting himself 8 plus receptions in 2 of the last 3 games. Tua Tagovailoa as of late playing out of his mind since his return, a 76% passing completion percentage. As long as the opportunities continue to rain in the direction of Jaylen Waddle, taking on the Texans, the 2nd best matchup at the position, I would assume that Jaylen Waddle should once again succeed within the upcoming potential shootout. Our number 27 is Jakobi Meyers. Now again, we did in fact see that Aiden O'Connell was at practice today. Now there's a possibility that Aiden O'Connell's injury and the severity of said injury was blown out of proportion. But if, in fact, we're going to be in a situation in which it's still going to be Desmond Ridder at quarterback, I'm going to lower the overall ranking of Jakobi Meyers to where it sits currently, number 27. In the event in which Aiden O'Connell does play, I would increase Jakobi's overall ranking because they take on the Atlanta Falcons, the best matchup at the position. Besides JJ going for 132 and 2 touchdowns, Jordan Addison going for 133 and 3 touchdowns last week, Ladd McConkey, 9 catches for 117. The Denver receiving corps against the Atlanta Falcons, 19 catches, 260 and 3 touchdowns. As the primary number 1 wide receiver, you would assume that Jakobi Meyers would have himself a nuclear performance if the quarterback play is efficient enough within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 28, we have Keenan Allen, who most recently against the Minnesota Vikings back in week 12, 15 targets, 9 receptions, 86 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown for 19.1 fantasy points. If we're going to be in a situation in which he's going to be exposed to a very similar level of opportunity, do not be surprised, especially considering the Minnesota Vikings are the 3rd best matchup at the position. We have recently seen the Atlanta Falcons receivers, 19 receptions for 310 last week. Marvin Harrison, Chicago wide receivers, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, all these wide receivers succeeding against the Minnesota Vikings as of late. All season long, the Minnesota Vikings have been a pass funnel, so hopefully Keenan Allen can take advantage of the upcoming matchup once again with a high target volume of opportunity. Moving on to our number 29, we have Malik Nabers. Earlier today, they did announce that Tommy DeVito will be the starting quarterback of the New York Giants, which gives me no confidence in the upside of Malik Nabers. Now, hopefully Malik Nabers is able to find himself double-digit targets in terms of garbage time, but quite frankly, we most likely are not going to see him scoring a touchdown. They're going to be double, if not triple, covering him and forcing the ball elsewhere. And in those circumstances, again, we're going to be put in a position in which we have to deal with the fact that Nabers just doesn't have enough quarterback talent surrounding him to make him a higher upside play than where he currently stands. Moving on to our number 30, we have DK Metcalf. Like I mentioned earlier with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, again, we know that the talent level of these wide receivers within the Seattle offense is incredible. We know the kind of upside that they are capable of when given ample opportunity. But as of late, that opportunity has not been there for DK Metcalf. Getting himself, 6, 7, 8 targets is not going to cut it. We need to see him getting 12 to 15 targets within a singular game in order to find that upside. And considering the potential return of Jair Alexander, who did practice earlier today, the expectation is that if in fact DK Metcalf is not able to score a touchdown, this may be one of the weeks in which we might want to sit him going into the fantasy playoffs, considering there may not be as much room for upside outside of a touchdown. Moving on to our number 31, we have Josh Downs, who again, most recently coming off of the bye week, but prior to that was dealing with a little bit of an injury. Now, Hopefully, he's going to be fully healthy, ready to go, taking on the Denver Broncos, who as of week 6 are giving up the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which you wouldn't expect. But again, the most recent efforts of Jeudy, 9 catches, 235 and a touchdown. Elijah Moore within the slot position, 8 catches for 111 against this defense. Myers going for 10 for 121. And even Trey Tucker within that same game, 7 catches for 82. There's a possibility for Josh Downs to have himself upside. Most recently from weeks 8 through 11, Josh Downs is averaging 14.2 fantasy points per game in the last 2 games in which he has participated with Anthony Richardson while healthy. 5 catches, 84 and a touchdown, 4 catches, 109 and a touchdown. Again, the upside is available there. Of course, we just need to see an efficient Anthony Richardson within the upcoming performance, and Josh Downs can very easily surpass the number 31 overall rank. Moving on to our number 32, we have Calvin Ridley. Look, coming off of a game in which he had 12 targets is fantastic. And regardless of whether it's going to be Will Levis or Rudolph this week, it does not matter. It's purely just a matter of the Bengals matchup being an advantageous one. The secondary is the 11th best matchup at the position, allowing over 28 fantasy points per game. We have seen Ladd, Pickens, Lamb, as of late, all dominate against this defense. Hopefully, Calvin Ridley is the next man up within this overall conversation. Moving on to our number 33, Marvin Harrison Jr., who will probably have the primary coverage of Christian Gonzalez over the course of this entire game. And that is obviously not going to bode well for Harrison, considering the lack of opportunity he continues to get. But Harrison as late has been 1 week on, 1 week off. Going into this week, he should be on based on the trend of scoring 10 plus fantasy points, then dipping down, then going up, then going down. So based on the overall trend that he is set, hopefully Kyler Murray looks in his direction far more often this week. And if in fact they're able to do so and the coverage of Christian Gonzalez is not going to play a factor that may negatively impact Marvin Harrison, hopefully he can find himself still being a top 36 wide receiver option. Number 34 is Zay Flowers. My only concern is that this becomes a blowout. And in the event of a blowout, they don't utilize Zay Flowers at all because they are running the clock early and often. It is the best matchup at the running back position, considering the rushing efforts of both Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. This could very easily be a game in which, if in fact Zay Flowers doesn't find himself in the end zone, there may not be very many targets going in his direction because, quite frankly, they're not necessary in order for the Baltimore Ravens to sustain a lead and beat up on Tommy Cutlets over the entirety of that game, which again could mean less opportunity share for Zay Flowers. Moving on to our number 35, we have Darnell Mooney, who's coming off a fantastic performance, got himself a lot of receiving utilization within the deep receiving game. Whenever you're able to make one singular play that makes your entire fantasy week fantastic, we love to see that. Taking on the Vegas Raiders, again, they've most recently allowed 2 receiving touchdowns to Jalen McMillan, the number 2 wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Hopefully, Darnell Mooney can be implicated within a similar role to find himself receiving upside. And hopefully, we'll see a passing touchdown for Kirk Cousins in this upcoming performance. All right, moving on. Speaking of a player that could potentially make his entire fantasy week with one given play, that's Jameson Williams in a nutshell. Now, as of late, again, he has still been efficient in terms of fantasy production, getting himself 7, 9, 10 fantasy points in games that he doesn't score touchdowns. But if he's able to score a touchdown within the upcoming performance against the Buffalo Bills, expected to be the highest scoring game of the week, indoor stadium, exciting game in Detroit, hopefully a shootout could lead to not only 10 points, but hopefully the upside of a 16-point performance for JMO for our fantasy teams. Moving on to our number 37, we have Amari Cooper. Look, Amari Cooper had himself a solid game, 6 catches for 95, but left a lot on the table. 14 targets, again, should not be overlooked, but in the return of Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid coming back this week, I would anticipate less opportunity share going in the direction of Amari Cooper, who is still coming off of the most recent performance of only playing 53% of the offensive snaps. The Lions are the 15th best matchup. Expect for this secondary to be taken advantage of, whether it is guys like Shakir, Cooper, it could be Keon Coleman when he returns playing well. It could be Mac Hollins. There's a lot of mouths to feed within this offense. Our number 38 is DeAndre Hopkins, who's coming off of back-to-back games of 9+ targets, which is quite promising, and has an opportunity of taking on the Browns, who are the 6th best matchup at the position. The Cleveland Browns allowing over 30 fantasy points per game as of late. As long as DeAndre Hopkins is going to be given the ample opportunity share, expect him to either find himself in the end zone or with a decent enough receiving yard total to be a significant option at a top 40 capacity. Moving on to our number 39, we have DeVonta Smith. Look, with Jalen Hurts throwing for 108 and 118 passing yards in the last 2 games, we're not expecting a lot of target volume opportunity going in the direction of DeVonta Smith because this offense does not throw the ball enough. And because of that, we have a pissed off A.J. Brown. I'm sure DeVonta Smith isn't feeling excited about the overall offense, especially considering his lack of opportunity has really just phased them away within the offense. It has really just been the running game of Saquon Barkley that leads this team to the promised land, and I don't blame them for leaning upon Saquon, but push comes to shove. Eventually, they're going to have to throw the ball. Hopefully, that'll be this week, taking on Pittsburgh. Hopefully, Pittsburgh's run-stop defense steps up so our receivers can find even more upside. Moving on to our number 40, the final player I wanted to mention is Deebo Samuel. Throughout the entire history of watching Deebo Samuel's career, he has always been the Ram killer. Anytime he takes on the Rams, he has himself incredible performances. As of late, obviously within the 2024 season, coming off of 4 consecutive games of less than 30 total yards. If we're once again going to be in a situation in which Deebo Samuel isn't given the opportunity, despite the fact that he used to be a guy that was averaging over 20 fantasy points per game against the Rams in the past. We've heard Brock Purdy with the media this week say that I want to get, Deebo the ball as much as I can, but I can't at times because, again, he's either not open or the scheme is being dictated to throw the ball to George Kittle and Jauan Jennings, who are finding themselves in incredible volumes of success. Either way, let's just hope that the Deebo Samuel Ram killer shows up in order to make this an exciting game. But again, I'm assuming if you have Deebo Samuel on roster, you're most likely not going to start him because you don't want your fantasy week on Thursday to end just like how Jaden Reed, cooked many of us last Thursday. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 40 wide receiver rankings. I'll be back tomorrow with my top 16 quarterbacks and tight ends. And again, back later tonight at 7 p.m. PST. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.